Today, we bring you an extraordinary story that will move your heart and ignite your sense of justice. This is the tale of Ava Price, a woman of strength and resilience who stood tall against injustice and inspired a movement for change. Through courage, determination, and the support of unexpected allies, Ava's journey reminds us all that even in the face of adversity, hope and justice can prevail. If you believe in the power of standing up for what's right, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more compelling stories that inspire and empower. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a moment of inspiration. Together, let's spread Ava's message of hope and courage far and wide. On a bright and warm afternoon, Ava Price sat in the peaceful solitude of a small cafe in the heart of the city. The streets outside were bustling with activity, the honking of cars, the chatter of pedestrians, and the hum of life that seemed to swirl around her. Yet inside this little corner, it was almost as if time stood still. Ava, wearing nothing more than a simple white blouse and denim jeans, blended seamlessly into the crowd, her unassuming attire betraying nothing of the magnitude of her life. To the world, she appeared like any other woman, sipping coffee and reading a book, but her presence in the city was anything but ordinary. Ava's journey had been a long one. Raised in the harshest corners of the city, in a neighborhood where survival was often a day-to-day struggle, she had fought for everything she had. She'd seen poverty, prejudice, and pain up close. And yet, with unshakable resolve, she had risen above it all. From the child who had worked after school to help her family, to the young woman who had hustled tirelessly to build her business empire, Ava had become a force to be reckoned with. She was now a billionaire, one of the most powerful women in the world. But despite her success, she often longed for moments like this, quiet, simple, and free from the demands of her empire. As she sat there, her eyes drifting over the pages of a book she had read countless times, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the world on her shoulders. Ava was used to scrutiny, to being watched by people who didn't understand how she had gotten to where she was. But today, for just a brief moment, she allowed herself to relax, to let the noise of the world fall away. That moment, however, would not last long. The sound of heavy footsteps grew louder, cutting through the quiet like a knife. Ava's instincts, honed over years of navigating the complexities of her life, immediately alerted her. She glanced up, her eyes meeting the figure of a man in uniform, a police officer, his broad frame casting a shadow over the table. He stood at a distance, his gaze fixed on her with an unsettling intensity. His uniform, crisp and neat, seemed almost out of place in the peaceful cafe, as if it were an omen that something was about to shift. Ava's pulse quickened slightly, but she composed herself, offering the officer a polite nod. She wasn't unfamiliar with being approached by law enforcement, though it was rare for someone like her to be treated with the kind of disdain she could sense in his eyes. His look was one of judgment, as though she didn't belong in the space she was occupying, as though she was somehow a threat simply because of who she was. The officer, Officer Raymond, took another step closer, his posture rigid and his expression unreadable. His eyes never left hers, his gaze cold and scrutinizing. Ava's instincts told her that he wasn't here for any legitimate reason. This wasn't a casual exchange. This was an interaction rooted in something much darker. Ava had spent her life navigating moments like these, moments where people made assumptions about her based on her appearance, her race, her success, or the very fact that she dared to exist in spaces they deemed off-limits. "Excuse me, miss," Officer Raymond began, his voice sharp and accusatory. "What are you doing here? This is a respectable area. Shouldn't you be somewhere more appropriate?" Ava blinked in surprise, her mind momentarily processing the words. His tone wasn't merely questioning. It was dismissive, condescending. It was as if he was questioning her right to sit there, to take up space. Ava felt her heart rate rise, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she straightened in her seat and locked eyes with the officer, her voice steady and calm. "I'm just enjoying my coffee, officer. Is there a problem?" Her response seemed to catch him off guard, but only for a moment. His expression hardened, and he took a step closer, his body language more imposing now. Ava could feel the tension building, but she refused to let fear creep into her demeanor. She knew better than to show vulnerability in moments like this. She had been down this road before. "You're sitting here, dressed like that, thinking you belong in this neighborhood," he continued, his words laced with contempt. "Do you even know who's in charge around here?" Ava's jaw clenched. She had heard these words before from people who assumed they had the right to control others, to dictate who belonged where. People who judged her based on her appearance, her skin color, or the success she had earned. She could feel the weight of those assumptions bearing down on her, but she refused to let them dictate her response. "I know exactly who's in charge, officer," she said, her voice unwavering. "And I'm not breaking any laws by sitting here." Officer Raymond's lips twisted into a thin, almost sneering smile. "You think you can just sit here, like you're one of us? You're nothing like the people who belong here." Ava's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't flinch. She had fought too long and too hard to let someone like him make her feel small. The world had tried to push her into corners, tried to silence her, but she had always risen above it, and she would rise above this too. Before she could respond, the officer took another step forward, a move that was both deliberate and threatening. Ava's heart raced as she instinctively stood up, her hands gripping the edge of the table for support. This wasn't just an innocent conversation anymore. This was something far more sinister. It was in that moment that Ava realized she wasn't just a woman sitting in a cafe. She was a symbol of everything that made people like Officer Raymond uncomfortable. A black woman who had achieved something extraordinary, a woman who refused to be silent, to be controlled, to be put in her place. And in his eyes, she would always be a threat. As the officer continued to loom over her, Ava's mind raced. She knew this encounter was far from over. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the contempt in his voice. But she also knew one thing for certain. She would not back down. Not now, not ever. This was just the beginning of a much larger confrontation, one that would shake both her life and the very system that tried to oppress people like her. And as she looked into Officer Raymond's eyes, Ava felt a surge of determination rise within her. She had survived much worse, and she wasn't about to let this man or anyone like him dictate her worth. As the officer raised his hand, as if to escalate the situation, something shifted in the air. Ava could feel it, the tension, the pressure, but she would not flinch. Not this time, not ever. The atmosphere in the cafe shifted almost imperceptibly, as though the air had become heavier, charged with the tension that swelled between them. Officer Raymond's gaze never left Ava. His eyes, narrowed with disdain, locked onto hers with an unsettling intensity. The world outside seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the oppressive silence of the moment. Ava's heart pounded in her chest, but her face remained stoic. She had been here before, in these moments where people sought to belittle her, to make her shrink, to remind her of her place. But Ava had learned long ago that showing fear was a weakness she couldn't afford. "Is this where you think you belong?" Officer Raymond's voice cut through the silence, loud and filled with venom. His tone was laced with superiority, as though she had violated some unspoken rule by simply existing in this space. Ava could feel the contempt dripping from his every word, like acid seeping into her skin. It was clear he believed she had no right to be there. Not just because she was a black woman, but because she was a black woman who had dared to succeed. The officer took another step forward, his presence more imposing now, towering over her like an obstacle. Ava's body stiffened, but she refused to be intimidated. She straightened her back, narrowing her gaze in return, and calmly placed her coffee cup down. Every inch of her being screamed to rise above it, to not let his judgment seep into her soul. "I'm just enjoying my coffee, officer," Ava replied, her voice smooth, controlled, and unwavering. She met his stare without blinking, refusing to let him see a shred of vulnerability. Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of years of hard-won confidence. "There's no law against me sitting here." The officer's lip curled into a sneer. "You think you can just stroll into this neighborhood and make yourself at home?" "You don't belong here," he spat, his voice rising with each word, his body language more aggressive. "This is a decent area, and people like you don't get to just walk around like you own it." Ava's pulse quickened at the words. "People like you." The phrase hung in the air, thick with the venom of racism and classism, as though she were not a person but a symbol of something that didn't belong, a disruption to the status quo he held so tightly to. But Ava didn't shrink from it. She had heard these words many times before from people who looked down on her, who saw her success as something that was not earned but taken, as if the mere act of existing in spaces they deemed off-limits was a crime. "I'm not breaking any rules," Ava replied, her voice calm and measured. "I'm not causing any trouble. I'm just a woman sitting here, having a cup of coffee. I don't need your approval for that." The officer scoffed, his eyes narrowing with even more disdain. "You think you can just act like you're one of us?" He shook his head, clearly frustrated. "You're not one of us. You'll never be one of us." Ava's heart fluttered in her chest, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of his words. The assumption that her skin, her success, her very existence was somehow less than theirs. It stung, but Ava refused to let it affect her. She knew better than to let someone else define her, to let their narrow perspective dictate how she saw herself. "I never asked to be part of anyone's group," she said, her voice steady and full of conviction. "I'm simply living my life. You should try it sometime." The officer's face reddened with anger, and in that moment, Ava knew he wasn't interested in a civil conversation. His eyes flicked to the side, as though considering his next move. And then, with a sharp motion, he stepped forward again, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "You don't get it, do you?" he sneered. "I don't need your permission. Get up. Now." Ava felt the words hit her like a slap. It wasn't just the order. It was the power dynamic, the way he was asserting his authority over her in a space where she had every right to be. It was a subtle but unmistakable move designed to force her into submission, to remind her of the perceived boundaries that people like Officer Raymond believed existed between them. Ava stood still, refusing to budge, refusing to let him dictate what she could or couldn't do. "Why should I stand up?" she asked, her voice low but piercing. "You have no reason to demand that of me." The officer's jaw clenched, and he took a step closer, his body now almost pressing against hers. The tension was thick, the space between them charged with the unmistakable weight of power and control. Ava could feel the heat of his presence, the force of his aggression. His eyes were narrowed, his lips curling into a menacing grin as if he knew exactly how to break her down. "I said, get up," he repeated, this time with a firmness that left no room for negotiation. His hand, still gripping his baton, twitched slightly, as if he were preparing to escalate things further. Ava stood her ground, her body stiff with resolve. The weight of the situation pressed against her chest, but she refused to bend. She had come too far to let someone like him define her worth, to let him break her spirit. She took a slow, deep breath, gathering every ounce of strength she had left. "No," she said simply. It was one word, but it was enough to shift the entire dynamic between them. Ava's refusal wasn't just a rejection of his command. It was a rejection of everything he represented. The biases, the assumptions, the systemic racism that had tried to keep her in her place for her entire life. She was a woman who had fought for her success, for her right to exist in spaces like this, and she would not let anyone take that from her. Officer Raymond, stunned for a moment by her unyielding response, scowled. His fingers twitched at his baton again, but Ava could see the hesitation in his eyes. She had drawn a line in the sand, and he wasn't sure whether to cross it. The standoff hung in the air, palpable and thick, but Ava didn't waver. The cafe around them seemed to hold its breath, the other patrons sensing the intensity of the moment. Ava was acutely aware that everything was on the line. One wrong move, one misstep, and the situation could escalate beyond repair. But she was calm. She was confident. And most importantly, she wasn't going anywhere. "Are you going to make me?" Ava asked, her voice steady, challenging. "Because if you do, I'll be sure to make this known to everyone. Not just you, but everyone who thinks that they can treat people like me this way." The officer's nostrils flared, his eyes still burning with contempt, but for the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty. Ava had stood up not just to him, but to everything he represented. And in that moment, she knew that her refusal, her quiet rebellion, had already begun to shift the tide. The officer's face twisted, but he didn't make another move. Instead, after what felt like an eternity, he straightened, his hand falling away from the baton. "You better leave here soon," he muttered, his voice low and seething. Ava didn't respond, but her gaze never wavered from his. Slowly, she sat back down, picking up her coffee cup again, as if nothing had happened. The confrontation wasn't over, but the message had been sent. The tension in the cafe lingered like smoke, thick and oppressive, as Ava sat motionless, her hand wrapped around her coffee cup. The officer stood before her, seething with frustration, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and disbelief. The fact that she had not backed down, that she had the audacity to refuse him, to challenge his authority, gnawed at him in ways he couldn't control. For a moment, neither spoke, but the silence only heightened the sense of anticipation that hovered over them. Ava's eyes remained locked on Officer Raymond's, calm and unyielding. Inside, her heart raced, but outwardly she appeared unshaken, her posture straight, her hands steady. She knew that this moment was no longer just about her and the officer. It was about something larger, about defying the system that had sought to break her, to silence her. The officer, unable to maintain the facade of control, took a step forward. His boots clicked sharply on the tile floor, each step a symbol of his rising anger. Then, without warning, his hand shot out. Before Ava could react, he shoved her hard in the shoulder, sending her stumbling back in her seat. Her coffee cup teetered dangerously, but she managed to catch it just in time, not spilling a drop. Her breath hitched, but her gaze never faltered. She was not going to let him see her flinch. Not now. The shove had been unexpected, and for a moment, Ava felt a surge of heat spread through her chest, the fire of indignation and anger. But she did not rise to meet it with violence. Instead, she straightened herself, slowly placing the coffee cup back on the table, her hand trembling slightly from the force of the push, but her resolve stronger than ever. The other patrons of the cafe, who had been watching from the sidelines, exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared to intervene. Officer Raymond was not done. He stepped closer, his face inches from hers, and his breath reeked of frustration and authority. His eyes were wild with the need to assert control, to put her in her place. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, a rasp that felt like a threat. "You're not going to make a scene, are you? You think you can just sit here and act like nothing's happening? This is my city, my rules, and you'll obey them whether you like it or not." Ava remained still, though her pulse was pounding in her ears. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, the malicious intent in the air. She knew what he wanted. He wanted to break her. He wanted her to cower, to show that he had the power to control her, that her position in the world meant nothing in the face of his authority. But Ava wasn't like the women he'd encountered before, who had shrunk under his glare, who had nodded submissively in the face of his intimidation. Without warning, the officer grabbed her arm roughly, his fingers digging into her skin with painful force. The jolt of his touch was enough to cause Ava to feel a brief flash of panic, a fleeting moment of vulnerability, but it didn't last long. Her mind sharpened, her focus narrowing on the task at hand, not allowing this man to see her weakness. She didn't respond with the fear he sought. Instead, she met his grip with the calm certainty of someone who had fought far worse battles in her life. Ava's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of years of survival, of strength. "You don't intimidate me." The officer's eyes widened with a mixture of disbelief and anger. His grip tightened, pulling her forward with sudden force. The chair beneath her scraped against the floor as she was yanked out of her seat. Ava stumbled slightly, but quickly regained her balance, her feet planting firmly against the ground. Despite the physical force he applied, she refused to let him control her. "Stop," she demanded, her voice stronger now, filled with defiance. "You don't have the right to do this." But Officer Raymond was beyond reason. His hand still gripped her wrist, and he jerked her forward once more, as if trying to drag her out of the cafe altogether. "I said get up," he snarled, his voice thick with the fury of a man losing control. The power he once thought he held now seemed to slip through his fingers, and his anger was morphing into a desperate need to reassert himself. Ava's breath hitched as his forceful tug caused her to lose her footing again, but she quickly steadied herself. She couldn't let him drag her through the cafe. She couldn't let him take her power from her, not when she had worked so hard to claim it. The sting of his grip was sharp, but her resolve was sharper. In one smooth motion, she jerked her arm back, freeing herself from his grasp, a look of pure determination in her eyes. For a moment, Officer Raymond seemed taken aback. He wasn't used to resistance. He wasn't used to this. But then his rage flared again, blinding him. His eyes flashed with fury, and he raised his hand, not in an attempt to restrain her, but to strike. The air crackled with the threat of violence, a momentary flicker of his frustration boiling over. Ava's heart skipped a beat, but her mind was clear. She had no intention of backing down. Before he could make a move, the cafe door swung open with a loud chime, and a new presence entered. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a suit. His gaze flicked quickly around the room, immediately locking onto the scene at the center. His eyes darted from Ava's face to Officer Raymond's posture, and in an instant, he was walking towards them with purpose. "Is there a problem here?" The man's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a quiet authority that immediately diffused the intensity in the room. His presence was commanding, and the officer's movements seemed to freeze for a split second, as if evaluating the new dynamic. Ava glanced at the man, then back at Officer Raymond, who seemed to hesitate, clearly not expecting the interruption. The officer lowered his hand, his anger still visible but now tempered by the unexpected arrival. "I'm fine," Ava said, her voice steady, though she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She stood tall, her confidence unwavering. "I don't need your help." The man nodded once, his eyes lingering on Officer Raymond before he spoke again, his tone deliberate. "Then I suggest we both have a conversation about what's really going on here." There was a palpable shift in the air as the officer, now facing the reality of his actions, took a step back, his anger slowly ebbing into something more uncertain. He had lost this round, and he knew it. Ava's eyes met his for a long, charged moment. She knew this was far from over. But for now, she had held her ground. The man in the suit placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity. Ava didn't flinch. Instead, she offered him a brief, appreciative nod. And in that moment, the battle had shifted, not just for her, but for anyone who had ever been pushed to the edge of their patience, their dignity, their strength. The air between Ava and Officer Raymond was thick with tension. The moment stretched taut like a wire ready to snap. Ava stood her ground, her body still, her gaze unwavering. She could feel the intensity of the officer's scrutiny, the hostility simmering beneath the surface, but she refused to let him see any sign of weakness. She wasn't going to let him break her. Not now. Not after everything she had overcome. Just as it seemed the officer might try to escalate the situation once more, a voice sliced through the tension. It was deep, calm, yet brimming with authority. "Enough." Detective Lucas had been standing at the entrance of the cafe for several moments, observing the unfolding scene with a sharp eye. He had been sitting just a few tables away when the altercation had begun, his instincts immediately kicking in as he saw the officer's aggressive behavior. Lucas had witnessed enough injustice in his time to know exactly where this situation was heading. The look of concern on Ava's face hadn't gone unnoticed, nor had the sudden surge of tension between her and Raymond. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, his figure cutting through the crowd like a beacon. There was something about him, the way he carried himself, the steady confidence in his movements, that immediately commanded attention. He didn't speak again until he was close enough to Officer Raymond, his presence so strong that the room seemed to quiet in his wake. His voice was low, but there was no mistaking the authority it carried. "Officer Raymond," Lucas addressed him directly, his tone firm but measured. "I've been watching the entire exchange. I'm a detective, and I can assure you that I won't stand idly by while a citizen is being mistreated in this manner." Officer Raymond froze for a moment, his face darkening. He had been momentarily thrown off guard, the abruptness of Lucas's entrance throwing him off balance. He hadn't expected anyone to step in, let alone someone of Lucas's stature. But despite the flicker of uncertainty, Raymond was a man who'd spent years asserting dominance in situations like these, and he wasn't one to back down easily. "What's your business here, detective?" Raymond spat, trying to dismiss him with a wave of his hand. His tone was laced with condescension, the old habit of ignoring anyone who didn't fit into his narrow worldview. "This doesn't concern you." Lucas didn't flinch. He stood tall, his posture unwavering. He was no stranger to confrontation, but more importantly, he wasn't going to let this slide. He knew exactly what was happening, and he had no intention of letting it continue. "It concerns me because you're abusing your power," Lucas responded calmly, his eyes locked onto Raymond's with unblinking intensity. The detective didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. His words carried the weight of someone who had seen far too much corruption, someone who knew when justice was being ignored. Raymond's jaw clenched, but there was something in Lucas's gaze that made him hesitate. It was as if the detective could see right through him, like he was able to read the undercurrent of shame that was slowly creeping up on him. For a split second, Raymond wasn't the officer in control. He was just a man caught in a web of his own making, and Lucas's presence made it impossible for him to ignore the uncomfortable truth. "I'm not going to let you treat her like this," Lucas continued, his voice softer now, but resolute. "Not when I've seen everything that's been happening here." Ava watched the interaction unfold, her breath caught in her chest. She had been alone in her defiance for so long, always carrying the weight of her battles alone. But now, here was someone, a stranger, yes, but someone who was standing up for her. The recognition of that, the feeling of solidarity, stirred something deep within her. She had worked so hard to build her empire, to earn her place in the world, and yet moments like this reminded her how fragile that place could be. To see someone offer her support when all she had encountered so far was disdain. It was overwhelming. Officer Raymond looked between Lucas and Ava, the line of battle drawn so clearly that even he couldn't ignore it. For the first time in the conversation, the officer seemed to question his own actions, though he was too proud to admit it. He bristled under the weight of Lucas's words, but there was an unspoken understanding that lingered between them. The detective wasn't going to back down. "I'll be taking her side in this," Lucas added, his gaze never leaving Raymond's. He wasn't asking for permission. He wasn't negotiating. He was simply stating the truth. And in that moment, the officer knew the game had changed. He could feel the balance tipping like a heavy stone on the edge of a cliff, and if he pushed any harder, he might fall. Raymond opened his mouth to protest, but the words never came. The sharp, cold reality of his situation had finally hit him. That his actions, his prejudices, were being questioned by someone who had the authority to make it stick. He could fight, but not here, not with witnesses, and certainly not with someone like Lucas standing in his way. Ava exhaled slowly, her body relaxing just slightly, though her vigilance didn't waver. The tension in the room, which had been so thick moments ago, seemed to dissolve under Lucas's steady presence. She had faced this moment alone for so long. She had borne the burden of her success and identity. But now there was someone who had her back. The officer shifted on his feet, looking from Lucas to Ava, and then back again. His frustration was palpable, but he knew better than to press further. With a final glare at both of them, he huffed in annoyance and took a step back, his posture rigid, his pride bruised but not broken. "Consider yourself lucky, detective," Raymond muttered, clearly defeated, though unwilling to fully admit it. He turned on his heel and strode out of the cafe, the door swinging shut behind him with an almost finality that rang in the air. Ava stood there for a moment, still processing what had just happened. She could feel the remnants of tension in her limbs, but she allowed herself to breathe, to let the relief wash over her. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup again, her fingers curling around the handle for the briefest moment of solace. Lucas stayed where he was, his gaze softening as he met her eyes. "You all right?" he asked quietly, his voice laced with an unmistakable sincerity. Ava hesitated for only a second before nodding, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Yeah, thanks to you." Lucas gave her a nod, acknowledging her gratitude without needing to say more. He understood. He didn't need to explain that it wasn't just about standing up to one officer, but about standing up for what was right, for what all people deserved: dignity, respect, and justice. And for the first time in a long time, Ava felt something she hadn't realized she needed. She felt seen. The door swung closed behind Officer Raymond with a loud final thud that echoed in the quiet cafe. Ava watched him go, her body still tense from the confrontation, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The relief of having anyone, stand by her felt like a cool breeze on a hot day. comforting, but not entirely enough to ease the burn of what had just happened. For a moment, neither Ava nor Lucas spoke. The hum of the cafe seemed to return to its normal rhythm, the clatter of dishes and the murmur of distant conversations filling the air again. But the memory of Raymond's harsh words lingered like smoke, threatening to suffocate what little peace had returned. Ava stood still, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped her coffee cup. Her mind raced, replaying the officer's every taunt, every mocking word. She had faced adversity all her life. From growing up in a rough neighborhood to climbing her way to the top of an industry dominated by people who looked down on her, judged her. But she had never encountered the raw, blatant hatred that Raymond had shown her today. It wasn't just about race or status. It was the way he had tried to strip her of her dignity, as though she didn't deserve to be seen as a person at all. I thought. Ava's voice cracked as she spoke, her words faltering before she could finish the thought. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, trying to find the courage to speak the truth. I thought it would be easier. You know? I thought if I made it, if I worked hard enough, I wouldn't have to deal with this anymore. Lucas watched her quietly, his expression thoughtful, but not judgmental. He understood the weight of her words. He knew that it wasn't just about the confrontation with Raymond. It was about everything that had come before it. All the years of proving herself. All the moments when her worth had been questioned, when people had tried to define her based on her background or her skin color. People like Raymond are always going to find a way to make themselves feel superior, Lucas said softly. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it held a strength in its sincerity. He stepped closer to her, his gaze unwavering. But you don't have to let them win, not today. Not ever. Ava looked at him, her heart racing. The words were simple, yet they carried so much more weight than she had expected. It was as though, for the first time, someone was acknowledging her struggles in a way that didn't feel patronizing or dismissive. Lucas wasn't just giving her empty words of encouragement. He was reminding her of something she had forgotten in the heat of the moment. She was more than the way people treated her. The tension in the air still hadn't fully dissipated. She could feel it buzzing between them, the gravity of what had just transpired pulling at her thoughts. The idea of confronting Raymond, of facing him in the future, sent a sharp chill through her body. She wasn't sure if she was ready for that. But Lucas was right. She couldn't let this kind of thing slide. Not for her, and not for anyone else who might be vulnerable to that kind of abuse. For the first time, Ava felt a stir of resolve. She wasn't going to be passive in this anymore. She wasn't going to let her success, her journey, be diminished by someone's misplaced sense of superiority. Not now, and not ever again. Lucas's eyes softened as he saw the change in her. He could tell that the weight of the moment was slowly sinking in for her, and though she wasn't completely ready to speak of it, he knew that she was processing the gravity of everything that had happened. That man, Ava began again, her voice steadier now, though still edged with anger. He doesn't get to dictate how I live my life, how I move through the world. He doesn't get to decide what I deserve. Lucas nodded, a slight smile tugging at his lips. Exactly, and he won't get away with it. We'll make sure of that. He paused, his tone firm but reassuring. If you want to pursue it, I'll back you up every step of the way. He'll be held accountable for what he did today. Ava looked at him, her chest tight with emotion. She had spent so long working in isolation, believing that she had to fight her battles alone, that it felt surreal to have someone who had barely known her for an hour, stand beside her like this. I don't know how to thank you, she said quietly, her voice thick with gratitude. You don't have to thank me, Lucas replied, his gaze steady and kind. It's my job. But I won't lie, it's rare to see someone stand up for what's right. I admire that. I admire you. Ava took a deep breath, the lingering tension slowly fading as she allowed herself to take in Lucas's words. They felt genuine, a balm to the rawness she had carried with her for so long. She could sense that he wasn't just doing this because it was his duty. He was doing it because, like her, he saw injustice and refused to ignore it. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a silent agreement that they wouldn't let people like Raymond win, not if they could help it. I won't back down either, Ava said with quiet resolve, her voice no longer faltering. I'm done with people thinking they can walk all over me. Lucas smiled, a small but knowing smile. That's the spirit. As they stood there, the cafe's noise seemed to fade into the background. Ava felt a sense of purpose rising within her. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for anyone who had ever felt small, invisible, or oppressed by people like Raymond. The world had tried to push her down, to make her feel like she didn't belong. But Ava was done being pushed, and with Lucas standing beside her, she knew she wasn't alone anymore. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the city. The fight was far from over, but Ava knew one thing for certain: she would never let go of her power. She would never let anyone take it from her. And as long as she had the strength to stand, she would fight for herself, for those who needed her, and for the future she was determined to build. The world outside the cafe felt distant, almost like a dream. Ava stood at the counter, her coffee forgotten, her mind racing through the events that had unfolded in the last hour. With every word Lucas spoke, she felt a renewed sense of strength. Yet, the fear that had clung to her in the moments after Officer Raymond's assault was still there, lingering just beneath the surface. She wasn't naive. She knew that this wouldn't be the end of it. The system that had allowed Raymond to act with impunity wouldn't let him go so easily. And whatever fight lay ahead of her, Ava was prepared to face it. But just as the thought solidified in her mind, the sound of a police siren interrupted her thoughts. Ava's breath hitched as the unmistakable wail of a siren drew closer. The sharp screech of tires on the pavement outside made her heart skip a beat, and before she could process the growing unease in her chest, the door to the cafe opened. 2 officers stepped in, their boots echoing on the hardwood floor. Ava's stomach tightened as she instinctively stepped back, her body going on high alert. She recognized the men. One of them, Officer Richards, had been present earlier when Raymond had first approached her. His eyes now scanned her with a quiet but deliberate malice, while his partner, a younger officer, stood slightly behind, his expression unreadable. Detective Lucas didn't flinch. He had been watching them arrive through the cafe's large windows, and his calm presence stood in stark contrast to the tension that swelled in the room. He stepped forward with authority, his voice cool and controlled. "What's this about?" Officer Richards didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at the younger officer, who gave a slight nod, then turned back to Lucas with a sneer. "We're here to take a statement from Miss Price. We have reports of an incident involving a physical altercation. We need her to come down to the station." Ava's pulse quickened. She knew the game they were playing. This wasn't about investigating an assault. This was about intimidation, about forcing her to back down, about reminding her who held the power. It was a tactic, one she had seen all too often, but she wouldn't let them push her around. Not again. Lucas didn't hesitate. His voice was unwavering as he addressed the officers, his eyes sharp and focused. "She doesn't need to go anywhere without legal representation. You can't just show up here and expect her to comply. I'm advising my client to remain here, and you're going to have to make your case elsewhere." Richard's jaw clenched, and Ava could see the resentment in his eyes. He wasn't used to being challenged. The younger officer shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable with the tension building in the air, but Richards was the one in charge, and he wasn't going to back down easily. "Look," Richards spat, his voice cold, "this is an official matter. We have our orders, and we'll take her in if we have to." He paused for a moment, his gaze lingering on Ava as if daring her to protest. "You can't hide behind your lawyer forever." Ava felt a flash of anger surge within her, but she forced herself to stay calm. Lucas was right. She couldn't let them bait her into losing control. She wasn't the same woman she had been when Raymond first cornered her. She was stronger now. She had to be. "Detective Lucas is right," Ava said, her voice steady, cutting through the tension like a knife. "You can take your orders elsewhere. I won't be intimidated, and I'm not going anywhere without a lawyer." Richards glared at her, but for a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the awareness that this wasn't going to be as easy as he had hoped. He turned to his partner, exchanging a quick glance before he spoke again, his tone more measured, though still carrying an edge. "We'll be back," he muttered, as if it were a threat, before turning on his heel and marching out the door with his partner in tow. The sound of their footsteps faded into the distance, leaving only the hum of the cafe and the soft clinking of cups behind. Ava let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding, her chest still tight with the weight of what had just happened. "They won't give up, will they?" Ava asked quietly, her gaze fixed on the door through which the officers had just left. "No," Lucas said, his voice dark but resolute. "But they'll have to play by the rules. You've got the law on your side, and I'll make sure of it." Ava felt a flicker of relief at his words, though the unease still gnawed at her. This wasn't the kind of fight she had imagined when she first decided to stand up to injustice. She had known that power and privilege would fight back, but the reality was even harsher than she had anticipated. These men had connections. They had the system on their side. And yet, for the first time, she wasn't backing down. "We need to prepare," Lucas continued. "They'll try everything they can to intimidate you, but I won't let them. I'll make sure you have the best defense, Ava. You're not alone in this." Ava nodded, the weight of his words settling into her bones. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. This wasn't about one isolated incident or one officer who had crossed the line. This was about a system that had been broken for too long. And if she had the power to change it, she would. She wouldn't let them control her narrative. As she turned back to Lucas, determination burning in her eyes, she spoke the words that would set the course for everything that came after. "I'm ready," she said, her voice firm. "Let's take them down." The fight had only just begun. But this time, Ava knew she wouldn't be facing it alone. The air inside the police station was sterile, cold, and oppressive, a stark contrast to the warmth and life that Ava had spent so many years building outside its walls. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the harsh sound of a distant printer filled the quiet moments between conversations. Ava sat alone in a stark metal chair, the cold seeping through her clothing. Her hands were clenched tightly in her lap, her fingers trembling ever so slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline that still buzzed beneath her skin. She had been through so much, but this was different. The events of the past few hours had shaken her, but she was far from broken. Each new challenge she faced was yet another moment of resistance against the systems that had once kept her down. Ava's journey had never been an easy one, but it had always been hers to take. And this fight, this one, was no different. As she sat in that harshly lit room, she allowed herself a moment to reflect. From the grimy streets of her childhood neighborhood to the corner office of her billion-dollar company, she had climbed mountains, faced down countless obstacles, and overcome every adversity life had thrown her way. She knew what it meant to fight for what she deserved, for what others like her were denied. And she wasn't going to stop now. This was just another battle, a fight not only for herself, but for every person who had ever been mistreated, overlooked, or silenced. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a door opening. Detective Lucas walked into the room, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp. He took a moment to assess her, his gaze flickering over her as if trying to read her mind. Ava met his eyes, the quiet strength that had always defined her shining through. "We're here," Lucas said simply, breaking the silence. He stood a few paces away, his posture poised and ready. Though he exuded calmness, Ava could tell the tension in his body was far from relaxed. She knew the stakes. They all did. Ava took a deep breath, straightening her back as she prepared herself for what was about to come. She couldn't afford to show any weakness. Not now. Not when the weight of everything she had worked for was on the line. This was no longer just about a confrontation with one officer or one case of misconduct. This was about exposing the very foundation of the system that had allowed people like Officer Raymond to act with impunity. "Are we ready?" she asked, her voice steady, her gaze never leaving Lucas. Lucas gave her a nod. "They're gathering the paperwork now, but we have a bit of time before we get access to Raymond's file. I'll make sure everything is on the record." His voice was calm, but Ava could see the undercurrent of urgency in his eyes. He knew what was at stake, just as she did. Ava didn't respond immediately. She let the quiet settle around them, taking a moment to center herself, to find that place inside where she could stand tall against whatever was to come. The fear that had once been present in her gut was gone now, replaced by a quiet determination. She wasn't just a woman sitting in a cold, sterile room. She was a force. She had the means, the drive, and the courage to fight this battle, and she wasn't about to back down. In the distance, she heard the muffled sounds of voices in the hallway, footsteps, and the occasional clatter of something being dropped. The station was busy, as it always was. But Ava wasn't focused on the noise. Her mind was already miles ahead, considering every possible angle of this case. She knew they would do everything they could to silence her, to discredit her. But she also knew they couldn't hide the truth forever. Raymond's not the only problem, Ava said, her voice low but firm, breaking the silence between them. Lucas raised an eyebrow, giving her a look that asked her to elaborate. The whole system is the problem, she continued, her eyes flashing with the fire that had carried her through countless other trials. It's bigger than Raymond. He's just a small part of a much larger issue. I'm not here to just fight for myself. I'm fighting for everyone who's ever been overlooked or treated like they don't matter. We're going to hold every single one of them accountable. Lucas nodded, his face hardening with the same resolve she could feel in her own chest. I know. And I'm with you every step of the way. We're not letting this go. Just then, a man in a uniform entered the room, his demeanor cold and professional. He handed a folder over to Lucas, who flipped it open without a second glance. Ava could see the quick flicker of his eyes over the paperwork before he closed it and nodded. They're ready to take you into questioning now, Lucas said. Just remember, stay calm. We know our rights. Don't let them pressure you into anything. Ava nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle deep within her. This was it. There would be no turning back from this point. The question of whether they would back down or not didn't matter now. What mattered was whether she could hold on to her resolve, her truth, in the face of everything they might throw at her. She stood up, the cold steel of the chair echoing as it scraped against the floor, and followed Lucas out of the room. As they walked down the hallway, Ava's mind raced. This wasn't just about a fight for justice. It was about showing the world that power, when abused, could be confronted. It wasn't about bending to the weight of a corrupt system, but rising above it. They reached the interrogation room, and Ava took a deep breath before stepping inside. The room was stark, almost clinical in its simplicity. A single table, 2 chairs, and the cold, indifferent eyes of the officers waiting for her. But this time, Ava wasn't intimidated. This time, she would make her stand. As she sat down across from the officers, her gaze unwavering, she couldn't help but think of the many battles she had fought and won. This one, she was certain, would be no different. This was just the beginning. The system had no idea what it was about to face. The hours that followed Ava's interrogation at the police station were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and hushed conversations. Though the noise of the station still echoed in the background, Ava felt as though she were standing in a different world, one where her actions had weight, where her decisions carried the power to alter the course of events. She knew this wasn't just about her anymore. This was the beginning of something much bigger, something that would ripple out far beyond this moment. Ava was no longer the woman who had sat in that cold chair, alone with her thoughts. She had a team behind her now, and that team was relentless. They knew what they were up against, and they were prepared to fight for the truth. Lucas led Ava into a small conference room, where a woman was already waiting for them. Sandra King, an experienced attorney known for her fierce defense of civil rights cases, had been one of the first people Lucas had contacted when he realized how serious the situation was. Sandra was everything Ava needed in this moment. Sharp, determined, and unwavering in her pursuit of justice. As Ava walked into the room, Sandra stood up, offering a firm handshake. Her eyes were calculating, but there was an unmistakable warmth behind her professional demeanor. Ava could see that Sandra was no stranger to the weight of a fight like this one. I've reviewed the preliminary details, Sandra began, as they all sat down. I'm sorry you had to go through this, Ava, but we're not going to let them get away with it. She pulled out a tablet and began to type rapidly, making quick notes of everything Ava had said. The first step is to document everything, every moment, every detail. We need a record of the harassment, the abuse of power, and every person involved. And we need to move fast. The more pressure we can put on them early, the better. Ava nodded, her eyes steady. She had already committed to this fight. Now, she had to be sure every part of it was handled with precision. She trusted Sandra's expertise. This wasn't a case they could afford to lose. They've been abusing their power for years, Ava said, her voice unwavering. It's not just Raymond. He's just the tip of the iceberg. This system is broken, and it's time to expose it for what it is. Sandra's gaze never wavered as she listened. She had seen cases like this before, but the circumstances were different this time. Ava wasn't just another victim in a long line of injustice. She was a force to be reckoned with, the kind of person who could turn the tides in ways others couldn't. Exactly, Sandra agreed. And that's why we need to go public. We'll file a lawsuit against Officer Raymond for the immediate abuse, but we can also push for a broader investigation into the entire department. We need to show how systemic this is, how this type of misconduct is not just happening in a vacuum. Ava listened closely as Sandra explained the steps that would need to be taken. The lawsuit would be the first step in what promised to be a long and challenging process. But the legal action was just the beginning. They would demand the release of Officer Raymond's records, request an independent investigation into the department's practices, and file complaints against the officers who had assisted him. The goal was clear: to dismantle the abuse of power from the inside out. "Do you have everything you need?" Lucas asked, his voice filled with quiet determination. Sandra nodded, her face set in a serious expression. "I've got what I need for now. I'll begin drafting the lawsuit this evening. The next few weeks will be critical. We'll need witnesses, surveillance footage, and statements from anyone who might have seen what happened. If we can prove this wasn't an isolated incident, that Officer Raymond has a history of targeting people based on race or socioeconomic status, we'll have a much stronger case." Ava felt the weight of Sandra's words. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about exposing a system that had allowed this kind of behavior to continue unchecked. Ava knew the stakes, and she understood that the road ahead would be filled with obstacles. But she was ready for it. This wasn't just her fight. It was for everyone who had ever felt the weight of an unjust system pressing down on them. "There's something else we need to discuss," Sandra added, her tone taking on a more somber note. "This case is going to attract a lot of attention. The press will be all over it, and not everyone will be on your side. There will be those who will try to discredit you, to turn this into a battle of your character. We need to be prepared for that." Ava's jaw tightened. She had dealt with critics her entire life. People who doubted her, questioned her, tried to undermine her at every turn. But this time, there was no turning back. She had been underestimated before, and she would prove them all wrong again. "I'm ready," Ava said firmly. "They've been wrong about me my whole life. This time, I'm not backing down. This time, we expose the truth." Lucas gave her a reassuring nod. "We're in this together. We'll make sure they see this through." Sandra gave a sharp, approving nod as she stood up and gathered her notes. "Then let's get to work." The decision was made. Ava had made her choice, and there was no turning back now. They would take this fight to the courts, to the public, and to anyone who would listen. The case would be filed in the coming days, and the legal team would begin gathering evidence immediately. They would not rest until they had shown the world the truth of what had happened, and until Officer Raymond and the entire system that allowed such abuse would be held accountable. Ava left the conference room feeling more empowered than ever. She had already overcome so much in her life, but now she was fighting for something bigger than herself. For the truth, for justice, and most importantly, for the future. The fight had just begun, and Ava was ready to see it through to the end. The weight of the world seemed to settle on Ava's shoulders as she stepped into the bright lights of the press conference room. Journalists from every major network were gathered, eager to hear her speak. Ava had become more than just a woman filing a lawsuit. She was now the face of a battle that had been quietly brewing for years. The battle against systemic abuse, racial prejudice, and the corrupt systems that had long protected those in power. The room buzzed with the sound of camera shutters clicking. reporters murmuring amongst themselves, trying to secure the best position for the story that was unfolding before them. But Ava stood tall, composed, her eyes focused, her breath steady. She had come a long way from the frightened woman who had first stepped into the police station. Today, she was a force. Lucas stood by her side, Sandra beside him, offering silent support. The stage had been set for this moment. Kat and Ava knew she couldn't afford to let fear cloud her voice. She was not here to seek pity. She was here to demand justice. As the microphone was handed to her, Ava felt the weight of the moment sink in. The eyes of the nation were on her, and she was about to speak for those who had been silenced for too long. She glanced at the reporters in the room, then took a deep breath and began. "My name is Ava Price," she said, her voice steady and powerful, filling every corner of the room. "I am here today not just for myself, but for everyone who has been subjected to injustice, for everyone who has felt the sting of systemic abuse, of a system that values power over people. This is not just a personal fight. This is a fight for truth, for fairness, and for equality." The room fell silent, every ear tuned to her words. "I am filing this lawsuit because I refuse to allow what happened to me to be swept under the rug. I refuse to allow the abuse of power to go unchecked. I am here because I want to see accountability. I want to see justice, not just for me, but for every individual who has ever been targeted by those who think their position of power gives them the right to treat others with contempt." Ava paused, letting her words sink in. The silence in the room was thick with anticipation. She could feel the eyes of the journalists, the weight of their scrutiny, but it did not shake her. This was her moment to make a stand, and she would not falter. "Officer Raymond," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "is not an isolated incident. He represents a system that has allowed this kind of behavior to persist for far too long. We are not going to allow him or anyone else in a position of power to escape the consequences of their actions. We are demanding accountability, not only for the events that happened to me, but for the many others who have suffered in silence, too afraid to speak up." She could hear the sound of cameras clicking as her words hit the air. Ava's heart raced, but she held her ground. She could feel the energy in the room shift, not just the press, but the people behind those cameras, the people who were watching from afar. They had come to hear her story, but now they were hearing something bigger. They were hearing a call to action. "I want to make it clear," Ava said, her eyes scanning the room, meeting the gaze of reporters one by one. "This lawsuit is not about vengeance. It is about change. It is about making sure this never happens again, not just to me, but to anyone. We must dismantle the systems that perpetuate this kind of abuse and inequality. We must fight for those whose voices have been ignored for too long." Her words rang out with undeniable conviction. This wasn't just a personal fight anymore. This was a movement. Ava felt a surge of pride rise within her, the same pride that had carried her through the toughest moments of her life. She had risen from a childhood in a broken neighborhood to build an empire. But this was her most important battle yet. As she continued, she felt her voice strengthen. "I am not afraid. I will not be intimidated, and I will not be silenced. I have spent my life fighting for what's right, for those who have been pushed aside, and I will continue to do so. This is a fight that cannot be ignored, and we will not rest until the truth is known and justice is served." The applause from the press was loud, unexpected, but filled with support. Ava could hear the reporters' murmurs, the voices rising as they realized the weight of the moment. This was more than just a lawsuit. It was the beginning of something monumental. Ava was setting the stage for an overhaul, not just of a police department, but of a system that allowed people like Raymond to thrive in their corruption. "Thank you," Ava concluded, her voice softer but no less powerful. "Thank you for standing with me. This is just the beginning. Together, we will fight until justice is done." With that, she stepped back from the podium, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spoken her truth, and she knew the journey ahead would be long and hard. But Ava was ready for whatever came next. She had just ignited a fire, and there was no turning back now. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the trial of Officer Raymond finally began. The air was thick with tension. Ava sat at the defendant's table, surrounded by Sandra, Lucas, and her legal team. Every pair of eyes in the room was fixed on her, some with suspicion, others with support. But for Ava, this moment was more than just about her. It was about every person who had ever been wronged by the system. The trial was about exposing the darkness that had hidden in plain sight for far too long. The defense, led by Raymond's lawyer, had a strategy that seemed to focus on discrediting Ava. They tried to paint her as a woman who was simply looking for attention, someone who had exaggerated the incident to further her own agenda. Officer Raymond, sitting in his seat, wore a cold, stoic expression, his gaze occasionally shifting toward Ava with the faintest trace of disdain. He was trying to appear unshaken, but Ava knew he was nervous. The walls were closing in on him. "I am innocent," Raymond had declared in his opening statement, his voice unwavering. "This woman's accusations are nothing but a smear campaign. I was simply doing my job when she made an illegal move. I was well within my rights." But Ava wasn't backing down. Her resolve was ironclad. She knew that the truth would ultimately shine through. It was only a matter of time. The prosecution made their case, presenting a detailed account of the events that led to Ava's arrest. They showed the footage from nearby cameras that captured the confrontation in the park, proving Raymond's aggression and the way he had escalated the situation unnecessarily. The images were damning, but still, Raymond maintained his defense. Then, in a surprising twist, the tide of the trial began to shift. Officer Grant, a former colleague of Raymond's, took the stand. His presence in the courtroom was unexpected, and when he spoke, the entire room fell into a stunned silence. "I've been a police officer for over 20 years, Grant began, his voice shaking with emotion. "And I've seen things that I'm not proud of. I've seen my fellow officers abuse their power, cross lines, and take advantage of people. But I've stayed silent, too afraid to speak up." He paused, looking around the room, his eyes meeting Ava's. "But what happened to Miss Price? That wasn't right." "I know it wasn't." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. For the first time in the trial, someone from inside the system was speaking out against the actions of Officer Raymond. Officer Grant's admission was a bombshell. He continued, his voice steady despite the weight of his confession. "I was there that day. I saw Raymond shove her. I saw the way he treated her like she didn't matter, and I stayed silent. But I can't live with that anymore. What happened to her isn't just a mistake. It's part of a much larger pattern, a system that encourages this kind of behavior. It's not just Raymond, it's the whole damn system." The room was electric. The defense attorney scrambled to contain the damage, but it was too late. Officer Grant's testimony was a game changer. He had exposed a truth that many had turned a blind eye to. His words carried weight, not just because of his position as a former officer, but because of the deep remorse in his voice. He was no longer hiding behind the badge. He had finally found the courage to speak out, and his truth resonated deeply. Ava watched him, her heart swelling with both gratitude and sorrow. She understood the weight of his words, the guilt he had carried for all those years, the fear of repercussions that had kept him silent. But now, his testimony was her ally, a testament to the power of truth, no matter how late it came. As the trial progressed, more evidence was presented, including testimonies from bystanders who had witnessed the altercation. They all painted a similar picture. Ava had been targeted, harassed, and mistreated without cause. The defense could no longer deny the truth. The closing arguments were the final blow. Sandra stood before the jury, her voice calm but powerful. "What we are asking for is not just justice for Miss Price. We are asking for accountability for a system that has protected officers like Raymond, who think they are above the law. Officer Raymond's actions were reprehensible, and the only way to ensure this never happens again is to make sure he faces the consequences of his abuse of power." Ava sat back in her seat, her eyes never leaving the stand. She had fought for this moment, fought for the truth to be heard, and now it was finally happening. The courtroom held its breath as the jury deliberated. Minutes felt like hours, and when the verdict finally came, it was met with a wave of emotion. The jury found Officer Raymond guilty on all charges. There was no escape, no more hiding behind the badge. The courtroom erupted into applause, but Ava didn't move. She stayed still, absorbing the moment. This was her victory. But it was more than just her own. This was a victory for everyone who had ever been oppressed, for everyone who had ever been silenced. After the verdict, as the cameras flashed and the reporters scrambled to get their stories, Ava stood with Sandra and Lucas, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We did it," she whispered, the weight of it all finally sinking in. Lucas smiled, pride evident in his gaze. "You did it. You stood your ground when most people would have crumbled. This is just the beginning, Ava." And he was right. The trial had been won, but Ava knew the battle for change wasn't over. This was just the first step in dismantling a system that had allowed abuses like Raymond's to thrive. But today, Ava had proven that one voice, no matter how powerful, could make a difference. She had shown the world that justice could prevail, even in a world that often seemed stacked against it. As she left the courtroom, surrounded by her allies, Ava smiled, feeling an overwhelming sense of hope. The world had witnessed her courage, and it had made a statement. She was more than just a survivor of injustice. She was a catalyst for change, and with her resolve unshaken, Ava knew her journey was only just beginning. In the weeks that followed the trial, Ava's life changed in ways she could have never imagined. Her victory in the courtroom was not just a personal triumph. It ignited a wave of change that spread across the country. News outlets heralded her as a symbol of courage, while activists and advocates rallied behind her fight for justice and reform. But for Ava, the spotlight was never the goal. The real victory lay in the seeds of transformation she had planted, seeds that would grow into something much larger than one story, one trial. Ava returned to her work, not with the weight of a legal battle hanging over her, but with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that the fight for equality, for justice, was a long road, but it was one she was now ready to walk with unwavering determination. She partnered with organizations that advocated for police reform and supported communities affected by systemic abuse, ensuring that her victory wasn't just a moment in time. It was a movement. In moments of solitude, she would reflect on the journey that had brought her to this point, the neighborhood she had come from, the countless obstacles she had overcome, and the decisions she had made to stay true to herself, even when it felt impossible. The woman, who had once been a product of a broken system, had now become the force that challenged it. But Ava was not alone in this. She had learned the power of unity, of standing together with others who shared her vision for a better world. Her partnership with Lucas, Sandra, and even Officer Grant, who had risked everything to speak the truth, reminded her that change came not just through one voice, but through the collective efforts of those brave enough to demand it. As she looked out over the city, the skyline stretching before her, Ava smiled. She knew there were many battles yet to fight, but she was no longer afraid. She had seen firsthand that no system, no matter how powerful, could withstand the force of truth and justice. And as long as there was breath in her body, she would continue to speak, to fight, and to stand. Not just for herself, but for every voice that had been silenced for far too long. Her journey had only just begun. And Ava Price, a name once unknown to many, was now a beacon of hope, a symbol of resilience, and a force that would not be ignored. The fight for justice was a marathon, not a sprint, and Ava was ready to run. Thank you so much for watching this video. Your support means the world to us. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this video with your friends. Your engagement helps us continue to create content that inspires and empowers. We appreciate every view, comment, and share. It helps us grow and reach more people with powerful stories like this one. Stay tuned for more, and we can't wait to see you in the next video.